they had pigs, they had chickens, they had ducks, they had turkeys. There was all kinds of livestock. Didn't make no difference. There was livestock all being judged by judges from different parts of the country to see which was the best of particular breed, whether it was the cattle, a steer, or whether it was a milk cow who produced the most milk, or a sow that produced the most piglets. And the stock show was huge too, because it was also uniquely part of the stockyards itself in Chicago. Now you have stockyards down in Kansas City, but Chicago at that time was the stockyards of the world. Chicago was Armour was the meat packing producers to the world, as what it was called then. And Chicago had that. The stockyards were sprawling all the way from 47th, I'm going to say in Ashland, down to Pershing Road, which was 3900 south, and 47th was 4700 south, and from at least Ashland to Halsted, which was a mile. So you had a mile between Halsted and Ashland, and from 47th to Pershing Road, you had about another mile. So you had like about a 2 square mile area of stockyards. And the city cowboys would be riding their horses, separating the cattle from one pen to another, depending on the breed of the cattle, the size of the cattle, the looks of the cattle, whether they were the best looking beef or the worst looking beef. They all separated them. And also individual meat packers would come by and they would buy certain, let's say we had over in this pen we had all white-faced steers or white-faced cattle, which was big at that time. The white-faced cattle, they'd maybe have, I don't know, 50, 75 head of cattle in there, and these meat producers would come and either bid on them or whatever, and then these cowboys would take those particular animals, go them down to a track, through a chute, and over on into whatever packing company they were going to. What else? The same thing you had sheep in the yards. You also had, like I said, hogs and pigs. It was very, very, very interesting as a child or a young snot running around Morgan Street and Pershing Road. That was the end of the streetcar line for Morgan Street. It didn't go any further than Pershing Road. It stopped right there. But in addition to that, coming out of the stockyards, they had a huge, as I said, when they moved those cattle down to different parts of the yards, the stockyards, they also had this big, huge, kind of like a trail built up above the yards where they could move the cattle from one side of the yard to the other. Well, in this particular case, they moved the cattle over the top of all these cattle under an underpass under Pershing Road, which came up right by the end of the streetcar line. Well, I lived, that was at 39th Street, I lived at 37th, which are like 2 blocks. Off of Morgan, I lived between Morgan and Halsted, which was about 2 blocks. But we also had a packing house right across the street from us. Now these city cowboys would drive maybe 50, 60 head of cattle down Morgan, down to 37th or 38th, and then over a block and a half and into the pens they would go into before they were led up a ramp to be slaughtered. I was a kid, we used to do those things. A lot of times, not a lot of times, but every once in a while, one of these herds of 50 or 60 cattle would go on a stampede. And they would go straight down Morgan Street from Pershing Road up to 31st. Matter of fact, they even went as far as 28th, even though Morgan Street turned off. But they would go right down Morgan Street and run out into what we had a city park there called Mark White Square at the time. And they would round up these cattle and keep chasing them until they finally got them rounded up and brought them back to the slaughterhouse. And as the slaughterhouse where I lived, like I said, I could stand at the end of on 38th Street and watch these cattle being driven up this ramp to where they were going to be slaughtered. And there'd be a guy up at the top of the ramp, and the cattle, as they went through in single file. There would be a guy up at the top with a sledgehammer, and as the cattle came through, he would hit them between the eyes with the sledgehammer to knock them out. Then they went into further processing for disemboweling them, taking the hides off, cutting the cattle, cutting off different body parts, and then splitting a calf or a steer straight down the middle of its back, and then you would have a half a steer here and a half a steer there, which they put on hooks, which ran on rails all along the meat processing and plant. So there were different ways that they had of doing things. But like I said, it was interesting, and we lived through those days. At least I did, and of course the rest of my family too. We even had cattle come down our street to the front of the packing house, knock over a big fence, and get down into a couple of vacant lots. And of course these city cowboys had to go wind them up and round them up and bring them back to the slaughterhouse. But sometimes some of the cattle died on the way after the stampede, and they would go out with a wagon, two-wheel wagon, with a yoke on the front of it, and then they would put a rope around the cattle's head and then use the horse to drag the body of the cow or bull, whatever it happened to might be, up onto this sled and then this wagon. And of course they'd lay it flat, hook it back up to the horse, take it over to the slaughterhouse. I don't know, is this more information than you need?
What are you looking at me for?
You can keep going if you want.
It's your project.
You can keep going.
Well, what else do you
Hey, Charlie.
need?
Part of the interview process is you need to ask him questions so he can answer. What are you looking on information for? Or what kind of information are you looking at?
You want history of Chicago? Of course, you had the Chicago Fire, 1871. One of the few items left standing after the fire was a water tower downtown, which of course is still standing. Mrs. O'Leary's house, well, that kind of burned down. There was one house that survived the fire, roughly around Division and Halsted Street. It became a historic building. Today I don't know if it's still there, but that was At that time, it was a good 50 or 60 years ago then.
Here, nice little pop quiz. Do you know where Mrs. O'Leary's house is nowadays? It's the Chicago Fire Academy.
You could put that on there. Chicago Fire Academy is now where Mrs. O'Leary's house stood. But nobody has ever been sure that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern that started the fire. And as it goes, the Chicago fire was not the only fire that was a huge fire at the same time up in Wisconsin. Up, I believe, near Racine. I can't remember the name of the town, but it was a huge marsh.
Yeah.
And that burned, and a lot of people, more people got killed in it, I think, than got killed in the Chicago fire. But people they don't hear about the Wisconsin fire because it was the Chicago fire that got all the news. I'm trying to go around the city a little bit.
Just think about what you want to know. What questions you want to ask.
Oh, let's put it this way. Chicago's lakefront today, as you walk, if you were to able to walk from, let's say, 95th, except for where the rivers entered into the city, along the lake shore, going north towards downtown, and even up into, at the time where the not the Field Museum, but the Museum of Natural History, when the World's Fair was torn down, what they had left was huge blocks of stone. And when they first tore it down, they just threw the stone along the lakeshore helter-skelter. If you were walking down there, which I did when I was a kid, you'd be climbing up a 45-degree angle on rocks and going down 30 or 35 feet degree down other rocks just to get to the water. Of course, after that, years and years after that, they took these stones and put them into place and made a step stone up to the, let's say up about anywhere from 10 to 15 feet of steps, more or less, going up to the ground, whether it be going up to the aquarium, or even if you were going up to Museums of Science and Industry, which is from downtown Chicago to the Museum of Science and Industry, 67, that's a good 8 miles, at least 8 miles, just to the Museum of Science and Industry. All of these rocks were flattened out, straightened out, cement put between them, and made real positive looking, good looking lakefront, which you have today. These are all stones left over from the World Fair of 1933. And of course, you went a lot further, you could go all the way up to 95th Street and still see these same types of stone being used as kind of a breakwater. So that was where the lake stopped, at those stones. And of course, Burnham Harbor, at the time, had very few boats docked there. Same, they had very few boats docked at Navy Pier. And for quite a few years, Navy Pier went into a state of disrepair. It was practically falling down. But then again, some of the foresight and future leaders of the city decided that they could rebuild Navy Pier, which they did. and made it